Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into what feels like a historical geopolitical thriller. We're looking at some wild archival documents uncovered by counselor Heidi Farook. She's an expert in border disputes, and these files, they offer a totally unexpected take on Egypt's historical claims to the Nile River. Now, just to be clear up front, we aren't taking any sides here. We're just impartially unpacking what these fascinating sources actually say about the legal origins of water rights in Africa. Let's get into it. Okay, let's dive right into this. When you hear about the modern tensions surrounding the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD, it's super easy to think it's just a modern-day standoff. But according to our source, to really understand this gridlock, we've got to dig up some forgotten archives. I mean, think about it. What on earth connects a treaty from 1902, an abandoned mega-engineering project, and a tiny village in Ethiopia literally named Egypt? Well, that's exactly what we're going to piece together. Section 1. The Forgotten Treaties and Lands. Let's move to our first major clue and see how this builds. The source argues that Egypt's historical water rights aren't just about sharing a river. They're actually built on massive, late 19th century land grants. So, who historically owns the Nile? This timeline is absolutely crucial for their argument. It kicks off in 1857, with Khedive Ismail literally buying land around the Nile sources. Then we see land leased to the Belgian Congo in 1894, an expansion into Uganda in 1899, followed by the landmark 1902 treaty with Ethiopia. Fast forward a bit, and we hit a massive crossroads in 1952 regarding dual dams, right before Egypt finally stopped paying annual rent for these lands in 1959. Now, you might be wondering, why would Egypt just hand over massive chunks of land? Well, according to Farouk's analysis, these weren't gifts. This was a highly strategic move to establish what's legally known as servitude rights. Basically, Egypt was trading physical territory to its neighbors in exchange for an ironclad, permanent legal guarantee of uninterrupted access to the Nile's water. According to these archives, this legal arrangement is the literal bedrock of their hydraulic rights. To put that into perspective, just look at this crazy contrast. In 1899, Egypt allegedly granted Uganda so much territory that it ballooned from a mere 5,500 square kilometers to a whopping 300,000 square kilometers. I mean, that is a massive expansion. And the catch? In return, Uganda agreed to never, ever interfere with Egypt's rights to the Nile waters. And they did something very similar with the Belgian Congo, too. Section 2. The status of Beni Shangul. So let's shift gears and look at a very specific spot on the map, the Beni Shangul region. Why is this important? Because it's exactly where the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is sitting right now. According to the archives, this area has a wildly unexpected past. Back in the day of Muhammad Ali, Egypt actually built a model village here to educate the local tribes. It was full of Egyptian engineers and garrisons, and get this, it's still on the map today. It's called Famasir, which in Amharic literally translates to Land of Egypt. Kind of mind-blowing, right? So how did Egypt actually manage this territory over time? It happened in 3 distinct phases. First, they bought the land in 1857, but then they lost physical control of it in 1882 because of the Mahdist uprising in Sudan. But here is where the legal aspect gets really fascinating. To keep their water rights active on paper, Egypt just kept paying an annual rent to the foreign powers controlling it, all the way up until 1959, well into the era of Gamal Abdel Nasser. They were literally paying to protect a river in a place they weren't even physically present in anymore. Section 3. The 1902 Treaty. And that brings us to the absolute centerpiece of this whole historical investigation, the 1902 Treaty. Now, this wasn't some minor handshake deal. It was a massive international agreement involving 5 major historical powers. You had Emperor Menelik II representing Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, plus Egypt acting through its governor in Sudan. Oh, and Italy, Great Britain, and the Netherlands signed on too. So the source points out that this was an internationally recognized border and water agreement, heavily cemented in global law. And this brilliantly illustrates the crux of today's debate. Let's look at Article 4. It explicitly states that Emperor Menelik II pledged not to build anything on the Blue Nile, Lake Tana, or the Sobat River without the direct approval of the Egyptian Governor-General in Sudan. Farouk's research relies heavily on this clause. She interprets it as an undisputed legal servitude right that completely restricts any unilateral dam building by Ethiopia. It's essentially the anchor of Egypt's archival argument. But wait, it gets even more cinematic, almost like a spy novel.
Shortly after that treaty, the Ethiopian emperor allegedly started encroaching on the very area where the Gerd is today. In 1903, a guy named Major Gwyn was sent to measure these lands and ended up getting imprisoned by Menelik II. But while he was locked up, he kept these secret diaries. And somehow, those diaries made their way out and eventually landed in the hands of Heidi Farook's grandfather in Egypt. Those personal accounts are now being used to argue that Ethiopia took control of the area by force.
Section 4. The Secret Subterranean Springs. Okay, let's pivot away from legal documents for a second because the archives also make some pretty wild geological claims. We usually hear that about 80 to 85% of Egypt's water comes from rain feeding the Blue Nile in Ethiopia. But this research introduces a totally different idea, the secret of subterranean springs. The claim here is that the most powerful continuous water source actually comes from underground rock springs right inside Egypt. The theory is that when the Nile enters Egypt near Elephantine Island, it widens dramatically because it taps into this massive, renewable network of deep underground water. It's a completely different way to look at the river's power. Section 5. The Al Mela Canal Project. And it's the discovery of those underground springs that leads us to a massive lost artifact of history, the Al Mela Canal. Just look at this number, 42 billion. That is 42 billion cubic meters of water. According to the archives, that's how much water this forgotten mega project could have added to Egypt's resources every single year. The plan was to tap into a natural depression linked to those massive subterranean waters and funnel it straight into the Nile. To put that into perspective, that's almost as much water as they get from the entire Blue Nile. Literally game-changing. The backstory of this canal is just incredible. The initial idea started with Muhammad Ali, but it was an American engineer, Cope Whitehouse, who actually mapped it all out in 1879, funded by Egypt. The project was so promising, it even had the official backing of U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt. It was all set to break ground in 1906. So, what happened? Well, according to these archives, it became a victim of international colonialism. The British basically sabotaged this joint U.S.-Egyptian project, and it just faded into obscurity. Section 6. The 1952 choice. But the dream of that 42 billion cubic meter canal didn't die completely. It actually resurfaced right before the 1952 Egyptian Revolution. Egypt was at a critical historical crossroads regarding its water security. So the crucial point is, what happened in May 1952? To maximize the country's survival, King Farouk actually signed a decree approving both projects. He gave the green light to the Amman Dam, which we now know as the Aswan High Dam, and the 12-kilometer El Malaka Canal to capture that underground water. But history, as it often does, took a different path. After the revolution, the new leadership under Gamal Abdel Nasser had to make a tough call. The engineers presented both projects, and Nasser ultimately chose to move forward solely with the Aswan High Dam. The El Malaka Canal was shelved and basically left as a giant what-if in history. Now, obviously, the Aswan High Dam was a huge success in protecting Egypt from droughts, but it meant leaving those 42 billion cubic meters of underground water completely untapped. So what does this all mean for us today? Through these archives, we're looking at a completely different narrative. Land traded for water guarantees, strict 1902 treaties, and massive abandoned canals. Unearthing these claims about servitude rights and secret subterranean springs definitely shakes up the usual conversation. It leaves us with a huge question. Could the legal weight of these 19th century archives actually impact modern geopolitical standoffs over African hydropolitics? Will these old documents change the future of the Nile? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep exploring.